On April 18, 2004, Americans across the country turned on their televisions to a haunting image that would forever shatter the perceived conscience of their nation. It was the photo of a hooded man, arms outstretched, electrical wires hanging from his fingers, balancing on a small box inside a dingy chamber. Behind the static buzz of the screen and the fabric draped over his face, the silence and helplessness of the man led thousands of American civilians and others around the world to a rude awakening regarding the true nature of their nation's operations. This photograph, The Hooded Man, was the first but not the last of many chilling scenes of torture released to the global public following an investigation of the Abu Ghraib prison complex in Iraq, 32 kilometers west of Baghdad. During the Iraq War, the U.S. military and the CIA repurposed the notorious Abu Ghraib prison, originally used by Saddam Hussein's regime to hold political prisoners, into a holding facility for Iraqi detainees. From 2003 to 2004, well over 7,000 Iraqis were detained within the Abu Ghraib prison center. And while some were indeed guilty of crimes like the plantation of IEDs and conspiring for terrorism, many of them were innocent men, women, and sometimes even teenagers, captured under suspicion of insurgency, terrorism, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What happened within those concrete walls between late 2003 and mid-2004 was more than misconduct. No matter how diluted and understated terms like enhanced interrogation techniques to describe the actions of American military and intelligence officials during the scandal become. It was torture, a severe war crime, and the intentional neglect of international humanitarian law. Prisoners at Abu Ghraib were stripped not only of their clothes and items, but their identities and eventually humanities as they endured the brutality of the interrogators. Executive orders sanctioned the use of special interrogation tactics like sleep deprivation, removal of clothing, stress positions, and even the use of dogs to incite fear in the detainees. Later, following authorization from Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, these tactics eventually morphed into a set of enhanced interrogation techniques that were at that point in clear violation of the Geneva Convention and other humanitarian obligations of the U.S. The abuse of the prisoners surpassed the scope of the executive order, so severely that, by the time of investigation, American military personnel at Abu Ghraib were regularly and enthusiastically using practices like sexual abuse, humiliation, and rape to mentally weaken and dehumanize the prisoners. Photographs of vile acts, including urination and defecation on the bodies of the detainees, and chemical torture were released, one notably being the chilling image of former American soldier Sabrina Harmon, smiling and posing behind a pyramid of naked Iraqi prisoners, their faces obscured by green cloth. So, the question that arises is, how did the scandal of the Abu Ghraib prison reveal the circumstances that enabled these war crimes, altering international perceptions of American exceptionalism and military practices in foreign interventions? Well, accordingly, when the world, and specifically Americans, were exposed to the realities of the prison, they were outraged. The principle of American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States held a unique moral responsibility to lead the world, was shattered by the revelations from Abu Ghraib. For many decades following the Second World War, the U.S. positioned itself as a liberator and protector of democracy, a force for good. Now, the world watched as the same country that condemned torture in other regimes was exposed for committing it itself. This shift in perception had consequences on civilian attitudes towards the Iraq War. U.S. military interventions in the Middle East became harder to justify. The supposed war on terror promoted by President George W. Bush had started to look like a war of terror, at least to many outside the country. But this wasn't just about a few bad apples in uniform, as some officials quickly claimed. A deeper look reveals the structural, legal, and cultural conditions that enabled these war crimes. The US government's initial reaction to the atrocities committed at Abu Ghraib was, well, simply silence. It was only following the release of the previously mentioned photos and evidence of the abuse to the media and American public that President George W. Bush felt inclined to deliver a public address to the population.
First, people in Iraq must understand that I view those practices as abhorrent. They must also understand that what took place in that prison does not represent America that I know. The America I know is a compassionate country that believes in freedom. The America I know cares about every individual. The America I know has sent troops into Iraq to promote freedom, good, honorable citizens that are helping the Iraqis every day.
In his speech, he articulated the incident in a manner framing the abuse as a unique and out-of-character, isolated event. This rhetoric was largely criticized by human rights organizations around the world, like the Human Rights Watch, who rebutted his comment by claiming that, in fact, the only exceptional aspect of the abuse at Abu Ghraib may have been that it was photographed. As more and more evidence came out from American detention centers in places like Afghanistan or Cuba's Guantanamo Bay, this idea seemed to be the more probable one, as the world began to wonder how many curtains like the Abu Ghraib were left to be uncovered. Ultimately, it was accurate that the pattern of abuse observed in Iraq were not the actions of one-off criminals plundering the American identity. The Bush administration had long set the foundation and climate for the neglect of humanitarian law through a chain of events and brewing ideologies. The aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001 further strained U.S. relations with the Middle East and jump-started Bush's notable War on Terror, or the Global War on Terror. This later prompted the United States invasion of Iraq, where the detainees at Abu Ghraib were captured, and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime in response to suspected terrorist support brewing in the region, along with the allegation that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. It later came out in 2004 that both premises were false, and the invasion violated the UN Charter. The 9/11 terrorist attacks and Bush's rhetoric additionally united the country in an extraordinary, vengeful way, where the military personnel deployed in Iraq began to subconsciously group and perceive Iraqi civilians as inherently part of, or a symbol of, the larger terrorism suspected in the region, planting the seeds for the dehumanization that later occurred during their handling of the detainees, and an overall increase in anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment in general. The Center for Constitutional Rights additionally highlights the role of private contractors, specifically the CACI, which was responsible for interrogation services at Abu Ghraib. These civilians, unlike military personnel, operated in a legal gray area, largely immune to prosecution and oversight. The abuses at Abu Ghraib weren't isolated, but instead revealed an underlying pattern of dehumanization that remains a continuity. Similar reports of mistreatment surface in current places of interest, like Guantanamo Bay, and in the Israeli treatment of Palestinian detainees, and it is crucial to be able to recognize them